Part 1, First Encounters, Between Curiosity and Conflict. Imagine this, the year is 1607. The air along the James River is thick with humidity, and the sound of insects hums through the forest. English settlers, their clothes torn and skin burned by the Virginia sun, step cautiously onto the muddy banks. They're exhausted, desperate, and hungry. Before them stretches a wild new world, vast forests, endless rivers, and, most importantly, people. The Powhatan Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Algonquian-speaking tribes, had lived on these lands for generations. To the English, this was the edge of the known world. To the Powhatan, it was home. The first encounters between colonists and Native Americans were filled with both awe and suspicion. For the English, the native peoples seemed like living reflections of the biblical, lost tribes, mysterious yet essential for survival. For the Powhatan and other nations, the pale-skinned newcomers were strange, unpredictable visitors, sometimes guests, sometimes thieves, and sometimes, potential allies. At first, curiosity reigned over conflict. The English, unaccustomed to the North American wilderness, quickly realized they knew nothing about the land. They didn't know what to eat, what plants were poisonous, or how to endure winter. Many of them were not farmers but gentlemen, unused to labor. When they looked to the forest, they saw danger. When the Powhatan looked, they saw life. And so, necessity became the mother of diplomacy. The Powhatan people began to trade corn and game for iron tools, beads, and copper ornaments. English metal knives and hatchets were valuable, and in return, the colonists gained food, their most urgent need. For a time, it seemed as though cooperation could prevail. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. The English didn't come to share the land, they came to claim it. They built fortifications, fenced fields, and wrote letters to England describing the great abundance of the New World. The Powhatan, in turn, began to question the settlers' intentions. Were these strangers allies, or invaders? One of the most famous stories from this early period is that of Captain John Smith and Pocahontas. Smith, a bold and charismatic adventurer, claimed that in 1607 he was captured by Powhatan warriors and brought before their chief, Wahunsinkaw, known to history as Chief Powhatan. According to Smith, as he knelt before the chief, a young girl, Pocahontas, threw herself over him to save his life. Historians debate the truth of this story. Some say it was never a real rescue but a ritual ceremony, a symbolic gesture welcoming Smith as an adopted member of the tribe. But what matters most is what the story represents, a moment of human connection in a time of deep uncertainty. Pocahontas became a bridge, a symbol of peace, a translator between two worlds. For a while, her presence softened the edges of misunderstanding. Through her, the English received food and guidance. Through her, the Powhatan sought to maintain peace. But as Jamestown grew and more ships arrived, that fragile balance began to crumble. The English population exploded. Forests were cleared, hunting grounds destroyed, and land that had once belonged to native tribes was fenced and plowed. The Powhatan's patience turned to suspicion, and suspicion to anger. In 1609, war erupted, what colonists later called the First Anglo-Powhatan War. The conflict was brutal and personal. English soldiers burned native villages, destroyed crops, and took hostages. The Powhatan retaliated with ambushes and sieges. Jamestown, during what became known as the starving time, was reduced to eating dogs, rats, and even shoe leather. Still, peace came, temporarily. In 1614, Pocahontas, captured by the English, was baptized and married to John Rolfe, a tobacco planter. Her conversion and marriage were used as symbols of harmony between the two peoples. For a moment, it seemed the dream of coexistence was real. Paintings of Pocahontas in English dress circulated through London, proof, many claimed, that savages could be civilized. But beneath that hopeful image lay tragedy. Pocahontas died only a few years later, far from home, in England, just 21 years old. To the English, she became a legend. To her people, she was a loss beyond words, another chapter in a story of promises broken and cultures colliding. The peace her marriage represented didn't last long. Within a few years, tensions reignited. The English, hungry for tobacco profits, continued to push deeper into native lands. They justified expansion by claiming that the land was unused, ignoring the complex systems of agriculture, trade, and community that had existed long before their arrival. By 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy struck back. In a coordinated uprising, native warriors attacked plantations and settlements across Virginia, killing over 300 colonists, nearly a quarter of the English population. To the Powhatan, it was a desperate act of defense. To the English, it was seen as treachery, proof, they said, that the native peoples could never be trusted. The English responded with brutal retaliation, burning villages, seizing land, and launching campaigns of extermination. And so, within just 15 years of first contact, the possibility of peaceful coexistence had given way to cycles of violence that would echo for centuries. But Virginia was not alone in this pattern. Up the coast, in Massachusetts, a different story was unfolding, one that began, like Jamestown, with hope and hunger. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, they too found themselves surrounded by native peoples who held the knowledge of survival. Among them was Tisquantum, or Squanto, a man who had already seen the cruelty of European conquest firsthand. Squanto's story, which we'll explore in the next part, captures the paradox of early colonial encounters, friendship and betrayal, compassion and exploitation, trust and tragedy. Because the truth is, America's story didn't begin with the Pilgrims or Jamestown, it began with two worlds meeting face to face, trying to understand each other, and often failing. And those first failures, those fragile, flickering moments of peace, would shape the course of an entire continent. Part 2, Alliances and Betrayals, the Changing Balance of Power, 1620 to 1675. The wind off Cape Cod was bitterly cold in the winter of 1620. The Pilgrims, weary, malnourished, and frightened, stepped onto the rocky shore of what they would call Plymouth. Their first months were brutal. Half their number died that winter. But as spring broke, something remarkable happened, an act of humanity that changed the fate of the struggling colony. One morning, a tall man strode boldly into their settlement and greeted them in English. His name was Samoset. He was a Sagamore, or leader, from the Abenaki people of Maine. The Pilgrims were astonished. How could a native man speak their language? Samoset explained that he had learned some English from fishermen who had long sailed the northern coasts. But what came next would be even more astonishing. Samoset introduced them to Tisquantum, the man history would remember as Squanto. His story was one of the most extraordinary in early American history. Years before the Pilgrims arrived, Squanto had been captured by English explorers and sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually made his way to England, learned the language, and found passage back to his homeland, only to discover that his entire Patuxet village had been wiped out by disease. Now, in 1621, he stood among strangers who had built their homes atop the graves of his people. And yet, instead of vengeance, Squanto chose compassion. He taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn using fish as fertilizer, how to find edible plants, and how to navigate the waters of Cape Cod Bay. To them, he was a savior. To the Wampanoag people, he was a man who had walked between worlds. Through Squanto, the Pilgrims met Massasoit, the great sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy. In March of 1621, they formed a peace treaty, one that would last more than 50 years. Each side promised to help the other in times of war, to trade fairly, and to maintain mutual respect. It was an agreement born of necessity. The Wampanoag were weakened by disease and threatened by rival tribes like the Narragansett, while the Pilgrims desperately needed food and protection. For a generation, that peace held. The first Thanksgiving in 1621, though very different from the story later told, symbolized that brief moment of harmony. English colonists and Wampanoag men feasted together on venison, corn, and fish, celebrating survival more than conquest. But beneath the laughter and shared food, power was already shifting. As more ships crossed the Atlantic, thousands of new settlers poured into New England. Villages multiplied. Forests disappeared. And with them, so did the balance of power. The English saw the land as something to own, the Wampanoag saw it as something to share. To the colonists, ownership was written in paper deeds and legal documents. To native nations, it was defined by stewardship, by care, not control. That difference would prove catastrophic. Over the following decades, colonial leaders began expanding aggressively, buying, or simply seizing, native land. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay, arriving in the 1630s, viewed themselves as a chosen people sent by God to tame the wilderness. They saw the native inhabitants as either souls to convert or obstacles to remove. The rhetoric of divine destiny, what would later evolve into manifest destiny, was already taking root. At first, diplomacy and alliances continued. The English allied with certain tribes against others, exploiting existing rivalries. They armed the Mohegan and Pequot in different conflicts, used trade to manipulate loyalties, and introduced devastating new weapons, muskets and powder, into an already fragile landscape. Then came the Pequot War, 1636 to 1638, a brutal turning point. It began with a trade dispute, but beneath that spark lay deep mistrust. English merchants accused the Pequot of murdering colonists, the Pequot denied it. What followed was one of the first major genocidal wars in American history. English forces, alongside their native allies, surrounded the Pequot village of Mystic in 1637. In the dark of night, they set it ablaze. When the smoke cleared, hundreds of men, women, and children lay dead, burned or shot as they tried to flee. Captain John Mason, who led the attack, wrote proudly that, "We must burn them." God laughed his enemies to scorn. To the English, it was victory. To the surviving native peoples, it was horror. The Pequot were nearly wiped out, their name forbidden, their survivors sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The English had sent a clear message: resistance meant extermination. And yet, even amid such cruelty, stories of compassion still flickered. Some colonists protested the massacres. A few missionaries, like Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, believed that native peoples were equals before God and deserved fair treatment. Williams learned native languages, defended their right to their land, and founded Providence on land purchased, not stolen. But voices like his were rare, and soon drowned out by the drumbeat of expansion. By the mid-1600s, the balance of power was collapsing. Epidemics, smallpox, measles, influenza, swept through native villages with unimaginable speed. These were diseases the English had carried unknowingly across the ocean, and native populations had no immunity. Entire tribes vanished within months. Where there had once been thriving communities, there were now empty fields and silence. And yet, even weakened, native nations adapted. They traded furs, negotiated treaties, and learned English diplomacy. Many converted to Christianity, hoping to coexist within the new order. Others resisted quietly, through cultural preservation, storytelling, and survival. Among the Wampanoag, a new generation was rising, one that had grown up in the shadow of the Pilgrim Alliance. Metacom, known to the English as King Philip, was the son of Massasoit. He had watched his father's diplomacy give way to betrayal. The English who had once needed native help were now powerful and ungrateful. They built towns on Wampanoag land, imposed English laws, and demanded loyalty oaths from native leaders. They hanged native men for crimes against colonists but ignored violence in the other direction. By the 1670s, resentment had become a storm. Metacom realized that the peace his father had built was dead. The Wampanoag and neighboring tribes faced constant encroachment, humiliation, and loss of sovereignty. So he began to organize, quietly at first, building alliances with the Narragansett, Nipmuc, and others. He believed that the only way to preserve their world was through resistance. In 1675, that resistance erupted into one of the bloodiest wars in early American history, King Philip's War. The war would change New England forever. Entire towns would burn, thousands would die, and both native and colonial societies would be shattered. But before the first shots were fired, there was still a sliver of hope, a question hanging over the New World: could two civilizations truly share the same land without one destroying the other? That question, as we'll see in Part 3, would soon find its tragic answer. Part 3, War, Displacement, and the Long Shadow of Conquest, 1675 to 1750. By the summer of 1675, the forests of New England were no longer quiet. The uneasy peace that had lasted for decades shattered when Wampanoag warriors struck back against English settlers in the small town of Swansea. It was the spark that ignited King Philip's War, one of the most devastating conflicts in early American history. What began as local skirmishes soon grew into an all-out war between native confederacies and the expanding English colonies. The flames of battle spread from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Maine. Native warriors attacked colonial towns in coordinated raids, ambushing convoys, burning settlements, and striking terror into communities that had once thought themselves invincible. To the colonists, this was rebellion. To Metacom, or King Philip, it was a desperate fight for survival, a final stand against the loss of land, freedom, and dignity. In the early months, native forces held the advantage. They knew the forests, rivers, and swamps better than any English soldier. They fought with ambushes, lightning strikes, and deception, the same tactics that had once frustrated European armies in their own wars abroad. English towns like Brookfield, Springfield, and Lancaster were attacked and burned. The colonists, terrified, retreated behind palisades and stone walls. But the English colonies were many, and their resources vast. They began to regroup, forming a united military alliance, something the colonies had never done before. The war pushed them into cooperation out of sheer necessity. This unity, born in blood, would later shape the idea of an American identity. The English also adopted brutal tactics. They destroyed native villages, cut down cornfields, and hunted entire families through the woods. Even tribes that had tried to remain neutral, like the Narragansett, were not spared. In the Great Swamp Massacre of December 1675, colonial forces stormed the Narragansett Fort in present-day Rhode Island. They burned it to the ground, killing hundreds, men, women, and children alike. By the summer of 1676, the war had turned decisively against the native alliance. Starved, surrounded, and betrayed by tribes forced into English service, Metacom's forces crumbled. When Metacom was finally killed near Mount Hope, his body was mutilated, his head displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 2 decades, a warning to all who might resist. King Philip's War ended with the near-total collapse of native power in southern New England. More than half of all native villages were destroyed. Thousands of survivors were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee north or west. Some were sold into bondage in the Caribbean, others disappeared into remote forests, forming new communities with remnants of other tribes. For the English, victory came at a terrible cost. 1 in 10 able-bodied men in New England was dead. Entire towns were reduced to ashes. Yet the psychological impact was even greater. The colonists had learned to see native resistance not as a misunderstanding but as a threat to be crushed. From this point forward, most colonial policies toward native peoples shifted from coexistence to control, segregation, and removal. The story didn't end with New England. As the 18th century dawned, British colonies were spreading rapidly, south into the Carolinas and Georgia, and west beyond the Appalachian Mountains. With every new settlement came fresh encounters, new alliances, and more blood. In the South, English traders forged relationships with the Cherokee, Creek, and Chickasaw nations. They offered guns, metal tools, and cloth in exchange for deerskins and, tragically, enslaved people. Yes, native slavery existed long before African slavery became dominant in America. English colonists and their native allies captured rivals and sold them to plantations in the Caribbean. Greed poisoned trust, turning old enemies into business partners and old friends into prey. Meanwhile, missionaries began spreading Christianity deeper into native lands. Some native leaders embraced conversion as a way to survive, hoping it might protect their people. Others resisted fiercely, seeing missionaries as the first wave of cultural destruction. Churches and schools began to replace longhouses and council fires. The English called this civilizing. To native nations, it was erasure. In the north, French settlers pursued their own version of expansion. They allied with the Huron, Algonquin, and later the Abenaki, building trading networks that stretched from Quebec to the Great Lakes. The French approach was often more diplomatic. They married into native families, learned the languages, and relied heavily on native allies in their wars against the British. But make no mistake, the French, too, sought land, wealth, and souls. This created a dangerous triangle, native nations caught between European empires. The Iroquois Confederacy, one of the most powerful alliances in North America, became masters of survival through balance. They played the British and French against each other, trading with both sides while preserving their own independence. For a time, they succeeded. But the price was endless warfare on their borders, and the slow erosion of their world. By the mid-1700s, native populations east of the Mississippi had declined by as much as 90% from pre-contact levels. Disease, displacement, and war had reshaped the continent. Tribes merged, migrated, or disappeared. Yet, in every corner of the colonies, native presence remained, in place names, in trade routes, in words borrowed into English, and in quiet acts of resistance that kept their cultures alive. And as Britain tightened its grip on North America, new generations of colonists, those who would one day call themselves Americans, began to inherit both the land and the legacy of these early conflicts. They built farms and towns atop the ruins of native villages. They wrote stories of courage and faith, often forgetting the people who had first shown them how to live here. But the truth lingered, in the soil, in the rivers, in the forests that still whispered with memory. Every road, every field, every boundary line drawn in those early years carried the echoes of negotiation, betrayal, and blood. Even as the 18th century progressed, through the French and Indian War, through westward expansion, and into the era of revolution, the relationship between European settlers and Native Americans never truly healed. It evolved from direct warfare to treaties, from treaties to reservations, and from reservations to centuries of struggle for recognition. Yet, through it all, native nations endured. Despite epidemics, forced removals, and broken promises, their languages survived in song, their traditions in ceremony, their sovereignty in spirit. And so, when we speak of the story of America, we must remember that it is not only a tale of pilgrims and pioneers, but also of nations who were here long before, nations who shaped the very land beneath our feet. Their story is not a footnote to American history. It is American history. Because the story of the colonies, their birth, growth, and ambition, cannot be told without the story of the people they encountered, befriended, betrayed, and, against all odds, never erased. And even now, centuries later, their descendants walk the same ground, not as relics of the past, but as living witnesses to a truth the early colonists never understood: this land was never empty. It was full, of voices, of memory, and of nations that still endure. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel.